we're now going to talk about how important mobile technology is for refugees, particularly in the context of East Africa. So as we've heard, as refugee movements came to greater public attention in 2015, many of us came to understand that the most indispensable tool for people who are on the move was the mobile phone, and we've heard very impressionistic first-hand testimony of that today already. We know that mobiles allow refugees to communicate with family at home, connect to others while they're on the road, call for help in emergencies, and receive assistance from NGOs when they need it. We saw this firsthand as consumers of news, and that's my business, when we saw images of people, say, lining up to charge their phones in the camps of Greece or along the Balkan route as they made their journey through Europe. And while some anti-migration commentators questioned why asylum seekers should have free use of mobile technology, and I'm pretty certain that no one in this room thinks that here, most of us did accept that the smartphone has really become a key feature of the modern displacement crisis. So that's the European context as we sit here in Paris, and that's one thing, but the fact remains that most of the world's refugees live in the global south, and many of them are in informal settlements, camps, places like that. And what we're going to hear about now is that there is a stark digital divide between those who arrive in Europe and can access this continent's highly developed mobile network, and the majority of refugees who are living in the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa, where coverage is often patchier, costs higher, and mobile interventions fewer. So today, we're going to hear first from Jenny Caswell, who is from the disaster response team at the GSMA, and then from Ben Hounsell from Samuel Hall, who will be sharing, both of them, insights from their new research, very exciting research, into mobile phone use among refugee populations in East Africa. Afterwards, we're going to have a little chat amongst ourselves, but first I'm going to throw it to Jenny to share her research.
I'd like to share with you a bit of the research that we've been doing at the GSMA, which is the Mobile Trade Association for Mobile Network Operators. I sometimes think that if I had to flee my home, the first thing that I would probably grab is my mobile phone, because it's my security and it's my connection to everything and everyone. And I think that's probably very similar for many of you in the room here today. So we shouldn't be surprised when we hear stories about how refugees arriving on the shores of Europe often need mobile connectivity ahead of things like food and shelter, because like us, it provides them with connectivity to essential services and connections to loved ones. Mobile connectivity can be a lifeline for displaced populations, and not just those in Europe. Every single minute, 20 people are displaced around the world, and the scale of the issue is global and unprecedented, and it's increasingly protracted. I think the ability for displaced populations to use their mobile phones to connect with loved ones, but also to access essential services like health, education, and finance is critical, no matter where they are in the world and no matter what stage of their journeys they're on. So the mobile industry today connects over 5 billion subscribers, and therefore I think that mobile operators have a very key role to play in ensuring that connectivity can be established for displaced people on the move. And mobile network operators are stepping up to this challenge, and we've seen many examples of this at the GSMA. So, for example, we've seen mobile operators in Uganda extending their coverage to the north of Uganda, where previously these were uncovered areas, but in the last 6 months, there's been 1 million South Sudanese refugees coming over across the border. We've seen information portals and translation apps being created by mobile operators, and increasingly, we've been seeing humanitarian organizations partnering with mobile operators to deliver things like humanitarian cash transfers. At the GSMA, it's our role to share these best practices across the mobile industry, but also with other stakeholders who are leveraging mobile technology to support refugees. And as you can see, on this slide, we've created a refugees and connectivity portal to share some of these initiatives. But I think it's important to remember that mobile network operators can't solve the challenge of connectivity alone, which is why at the GSMA we have created something called the Humanitarian Connectivity Charter. Basically unites nearly 150 mobile operators around the world with key humanitarian partners to ensure that access is reliable in times of disaster. a little bit about the research that we've done. I'm really excited hearing about solutions for refugees in Europe, but the research we've done is from a little bit further afield in a refugee camp in the northwest of Tanzania. So today, 130,000 refugees live in this camp near Agusu, and they are predominantly from the Democratic Republic of Congo and Burundi. And Vodacom Tanzania built a 3D tower there last year for the very first time. And this provided us with a really good opportunity to really measure and understand the socioeconomic impact of that mobile connectivity, because for many refugees, it was the first time they'd ever had access to the internet. The key findings for us from our quantitative research were that 2/3 of households in the refugee camp had access to mobile connectivity, which is surprisingly high given that mobile connectivity had only been there for around 6 months at the time we did the research in April. These findings were really important for organizations like UNHCR, who had very little idea of the mobile penetration throughout the camp, and estimates ranged from 5% to 95%. We found that nearly half of those refugees owned a mobile phone, but there were significant discrepancies in ownership. So for men, 62% said that they owned a mobile phone compared to only 36% of women. And the Congolese population, who had been there for over 20 years, 63% of them owned a mobile phone compared to only 36% of Burundians, who were a newer population who had been there since 2015. And nearly all of those who didn't own a phone desired access to one. So there was a very high awareness of the kind of impact that phones could have throughout the camp. We also conducted qualitative research through a series of focus groups, and we found evidence to show how mobile operators are providing commercial value, but also social good in the services that they're offering. We split these use cases out into 4 different themes. The first one was communication with friends and family. Probably very obvious, but for refugees in Tanzania who are confined to a camp, and many of them have spent their whole lives there, this is really, really essential for them to speak to family and friends who they haven't been in touch with and probably might not be able to see. The second one is livelihoods and mobile money. So refugees, again, in Tanzania can't legally work. And therefore, we were finding that refugees were using their phones to conduct business with host community members around the camp. And they were receiving mobile money through remittances, which was a key income opportunity for them. Thirdly, education. Vodacom Instant Network schools have provided something called a school in a box, which basically provides immediate connectivity and learning materials, and this was really, really important for people around the camp. And finally, an area I think we really shouldn't underestimate is connectedness and well-being. The use of phones, just like we use them for things like entertainment and relaxation. For people who are potentially stuck in this camp for a long time, I think this is a really, really important use case. And this woman said that she was paralyzed on one side, and listening to music on her phone, she thinks may have cured her. So the overall findings of the research really were that there is a significant business case to extend mobile coverage to refugee camps. There's a very, very high demand for use of phones. Secondly, humanitarian agencies are beginning to digitize their services, and this is really exciting to see. And given the fairly high penetration of phones in the camp, I think this can be done more, but agencies need to be very aware of the fact that vulnerable groups can potentially be excluded. And finally, the barriers to getting and staying connected are far more acute for refugee populations compared to a low-income population. So I'm looking forward to speaking to more of you about the research, and yeah, look forward to meeting you.
So basically, my name's Benjamin. I'm from Samuel Hall. We're a social enterprise that's really dedicated to migration research. I want to first show you a map that we came up with about a year or so ago now. And the reason I'm showing this map is it really shows the dynamism, the rapid changes in both innovation for mobile tech and in the refugee landscape, both in the global south and in the global north. What we looked at here was basically a summary of all of the mobile apps that were being developed in Northern Europe and equivalent ones that were developed in sub-Saharan Africa. And we saw, obviously, what can be seen as a pretty large digital divide between the two. But in terms of changes, in fact, innovations are growing in Europe, largely due to Techfugees and other movements. They've stagnated very much in sub-Saharan Africa. But at the same time, refugee flows in sub-Saharan Africa have increased, particularly with the situation in South Sudan. In 2013, for example, in Uganda, there were about 22,000 refugees from South Sudan. Now there are well over 1 million. Same can also be said in northern Kenya, with large inflows of refugees from the surrounding area. So you can see it's shifting very rapidly. So what we decided to do was have a look at one of the longest standing refugee camps in East Africa, Kakuma. It's based in Turkana County in northern Kenya, and it really is a nexus of migration in the region. It has refugees from the Horn of Africa, Somalia, Ethiopia, all the way through to Burundi and Congo. It continues to need humanitarian as well as developmental support from NGOs and from the UNHCR, for example. And the population also continues to grow. So I think it went from something like 130,000 refugees in 2013 to about 180,000 refugees currently and growing. And the reason we looked at this area as well is thanks to initiatives like from Safaricom, the mobile operator in the country. They have significantly improved mobile connectivity in that camp over recent years. So we really wanted to look at what the impact that mobile connectivity would have on the lives of refugees, not just in the camp, but as they travel to it. So, in terms of our research, we interviewed about 700 refugees from the 4 zones, if you like, of Kakuma itself. Age ranges from 18 to 80, and in over about 14 different nationalities to give us a really good idea of what was happening, potentially, across the region. In a similar way to some of Jenny's research, we found that almost everybody actually owns a mobile phone Kakuma. This is different, for example, to the situation in Tanzania, however. And that of those, almost 50% actually own a smartphone. Now, this is interesting because the actual average smartphone ownership in Kenya is about half that. So there really is an opportunity here for us to use mobile technology to support refugees in the Kakuma camp. Now, we don't want to forget things like age and gender, which are potential limiting factors for smartphone access, and we can talk about that perhaps in the Q&A later. But it's something that needs to be highlighted. One of the things that we really wanted to ask as well is not just in the camp setting itself, but as refugees would travel to Kakuma, what are the things that they needed most? And what was surprising for us was that information, particularly education and translation, were 2 of the biggest needs the refugees felt they needed as they went from their home country into Kakuma, into Kenya. And again, the unlikely answer for this is actually quite obvious. And we talked about it a little bit earlier in the keynote. English is a common language. It's a language that provides social interaction in what is a very ethnically diverse environment. And it also provides job opportunities both inside Kakuma camp, but also in the region around the camp itself. Refugees are able to leave within a certain area and return. Language is very important. In terms of connectivity, obviously, to be able to make use of things like WhatsApp, Facebook and others, you need access to the internet. About half the refugees that we spoke to do have access to the internet, but the vast majority of those get that through smartphones. Almost none are able to use Wi-Fi. There's very poor connectivity. Now, the biggest barrier to that actually is the cost of data. So you might have a mobile mast only 20 meters away from you, but if it costs you $1 to get access to 130 megabytes of data, we all know how quickly we can burn through that. And actually, for refugees who don't have a fixed income, even $1, it can be quite an impact. So difficulty charging phones and signal strength was also a huge impact. So it's quite odd to say this, but you would be in one area in the camp with a 3G network connection. Great. You walk 100 meters in a different direction and it's gone. You're back to 2G. And this difference between connection over a relatively short area can make it quite hard to get regular access to a connection. Many refugees have come up with quite a clever way to get around this. Of all the refugees we spoke to that owned a smartphone, about 50% have an email address. Now, of course, if you want to download an app, you need to be able to access Google Play, for example. To access Google Play, you need an email address. But people were using applications like FlashShare to allow them to transfer apps to each other, to friends and family, using Bluetooth, which means only one person in a community or area would need to download an app, and then they can transfer it to each other at no cost. And it's actually a really good way, almost a viral way, if you like, of sharing apps and information, even games that allow people to find out what is good and what isn't. And it's a great way, actually, that people have circumvented the issue of connectivity. What did refugees want most for the ones that we spoke to? Well, unsurprisingly, financial support was the top, very closely followed by education. Now, financial support of things like cash transfer, Jenny touched on this very briefly. Bampa Chakula is very well known inside Kakuma and other camps. It's an initiative by the World Food Programme that basically provides, if you like, mobile money for refugees who can go into certain shops and buy goods. The issue we had is the awareness, actually, of these sorts of services in the camp setting. So Bampa Chakula was fairly well known amongst refugees, but other initiatives were pretty scarcely identified. So there really is a need to raise awareness of what's going on and what's available for the initiatives that are being developed in camp settings. So really what I want to do finally is just touch on a very clever initiative that's been recently set up and piloted as we speak by the UNHCR in Kakuma. It's called iMonitor, and it's the brainchild of Caleb, who you can see in the UNHCR jacket on your right. The idea here was to provide a connection between the needs of communities and the UNHCR much more rapidly than they were getting before. So John is on your left here. He's a community worker. And he noticed the problem is community. In the past, what you have to do is go through various local leaders, NGOs, civil society organizations, and that would kind of work its way up over time to the UN, and then it would be acted on and then work its way back down again. And this kind of bit of dirt you're seeing here doesn't show up great on the picture. It's actually a pretty deep hole in the ground, which is the result of a leaking water tap next to a well. And places like Kakuma, they're semi-arid, drought is common, and so water is a pretty precious resource. So it's something that needed to be fixed quickly. So they use something called Kobo Collect, which many of you might know is a data collection tool, totally free, to allow them to effectively customize it and build a simple reporting app that allows guys like Paul and John to report incidences, which then automatically bypass all the middlemen and get reported to UNHCR on an app directly. And this means they can then work with implementing partners to solve the issue much more quickly than they would have done in the past. And it's made a real difference, to how communities are able to communicate with NGOs and with the UN, for example, to get things fixed. So in the interest of time, I think I'm going to leave it there, and then we'll take questions.
Well, thank you both for these really fascinating insights into the quotidian life, really, of refugees in settlements in East Africa. I think it's a really useful perspective for us to include on this day. I want to start, Jenny, by asking you about the business case for reaching refugees in camps in this part of the world. You've identified in your presentation that the business case is very much there, and we've also seen that there is a philanthropic case to offer these services for refugees. So I wonder, can you shed some light on how these two imperatives, the need to help people and also the need to leverage a customer base, sit alongside each other in the space from the point of view of the GSMA, and how one can be leveraged to help the other?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I think the answer is that it's entirely context specific and also mobile operator specific, depending on values. So for example, in a place like Turkey, where Turkcell has over 1.2 million customers who are Syrians, for them makes complete business sense to be able to provide services, specific services for refugees. And they've done that. They've created something called Hello Hope, which it's an app, but being mobile operator-led, it really has reached massive scale. I think it's reached 500,000 refugees in the country. So I think for Turkcell, it is a commercial opportunity, but their CEO, he was a refugee himself, and so he's really ensured that Turkcell as a company can do as much as they can to support refugees. In Uganda, where, as I said, over 1 million South Sudanese people have fled over the last 6 months or so, I think mobile operators were quite quick to realize that this could be a commercial opportunity for them, but also they wanted to support their own communities. And sometimes I think, especially when we're talking about extending infrastructure, the output is so high that the mobile operator really needs to understand the business model. And we've been seeing UN organizations like UNCDF support with that, which is really important. So UNCDF have been giving out things like loss guarantees, which says to a mobile operator, we will pay you back the money if you don't see a business case within the first 3 months. And that's shown to be really really important. And for areas where there's such high concentrations of refugees, I think there's very often a business case. In Niragusu, we saw the kind of, I think the perfect mix is where there can be a philanthropic argument for it, but also a commercial one. And so Vodacom Tanzania extending their coverage was a commercial opportunity, but providing Vodacom Instant Network schools is a purely philanthropic idea, and I think that they've kind of seen that they can do both. When those two things come together, it's a win-win for everyone.
That's great. Ben, do you have any insights on this from the sites that you've studied?
I think the main thing to focus on is how sustainable a project is, really. And sustainability means many things to different people, but I think for many, it's really, is there a business case? Can this continue beyond the initial support it might have received? And I think that's what most enterprises certainly be looking at when they're looking at how mobile technology, or the cost, if you like, of setting up connectivity in a camp setting or in a settlement setting differs. And I think it's also worth differentiating between those two settings. I mean, a camp, a refugee camp, for example, such as Kakuma, is different to a settlement environment such as, say, Naki Valley in Uganda, in terms of how people work, the opportunities they have for livelihoods, and the potential they have for making money, and maybe even spending that money on additional resources. So I think all these things come into play when we're looking at how they can work.
I think we're going to hear a little bit of this response again in our second question when I ask you, we've established that there is a digital divide between the global north and the global south when it comes to providing mobile services to refugees. But we also saw within data that there is a discrepancy often based on gender, based on ethnicity, and perhaps, as Ben's pointed out, based on the type of settlement we're talking about. Jenny, I'll start with you because in your presentation we saw that there was a discrepancy between men and women's access and also a discrepancy between access in terms of, say, a Burundian refugee versus a Congolese refugee. Can you talk a bit more about the gaps you found and how they might be bridged?
Some of the findings were perhaps obvious, but this research has provided us with evidence to really validate some of the things that we had assumed. And one of those is that there is a massive discrepancy in access between gender and ethnicity. And so for women, they had, not only did they often own a phone less, they also had access to a phone far less. So for men, it was 85%, and for women, it was 40% in terms of having 100% access to a mobile phone. And I think a lot of the kind of causes of this are in the context of Niragusu specifically. Refugees in Tanzania cannot work, and the few incentive jobs that are available from NGOs and UN organizations are ones that are quite manual work, so digging latrines or building houses, and therefore the income that people will get are mainly men. And so this makes the affordability issue for women even more extreme. And for different populations as well, I think there's a lot more that we can do to understand the length of time someone has been in a camp and how that means their ability to connect kind of changes over time. At the GSMA, we've got a program called Connected Women, which has managed to get 22 operators to commit to closing the gender gap amongst their subscriber base. And they're doing this through mobile money and also internet access. And so our team's working very closely with those operators to understand why that gender gap exists and to come up with strategies alongside the mobile operators to ensure that that gap can be closed.
Ben, I want to go to you because I know you've studied more longer-term settlements and you found things that are slightly different in terms of the discrepancies between, say, gender or ethnicity in places where, for example, women might be able to work.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things to add here. I mean, I think both camps that we're talking about are fairly old. I'd say the biggest differentiator here is how long they've had access to telecommunications, which has been key, I think, to the proliferation of mobile devices across genders. So in Kakuma, for example, we found that There wasn't necessarily a gender divide between people who had access to mobile phones. In fact, almost everybody has access to a mobile phone. We specifically asked in different focus groups and others if people were in some way restricted to accessing their phone by family members. This is some research we've done, for example, in Afghanistan, which showed that that was the case. Here, it really wasn't. And in fact, we found many matriarchs in the household kind of telling their kids how often they should be using their phone and getting off Facebook and all this kind of, just like we might do here back home. But what we did notice, there was a discrepancy, for example, between smartphone ownership. Guys tended to have smartphones more than girls. This is 60-40 kind of split, so not a landslide, but not the same. But I think a lot of that is an equalization over time as more smartphones come onto the market than they're available. You have to understand, in a situation like Kakuma, there are a huge number of different mobile devices that are available. And you can go and buy anything from a cheap, what we call it, Samsung device for $30 or less, right the way up to an iPhone 7.
I think there's a really important lesson here in terms of the way mobile services are rolled out. Because it seems like we've got two very different contexts within the same region. We've got very new settlements and more established camps. And I wonder if you think, for our audience here today, what lessons there might be in the types of services, the types of apps, for example, that are developed for one setting to be rolled out quickly, and those for more established settlements. Ben, do you want to tackle that one first?
One of the key things that needs to be done is to have a dialogue with refugees themselves so that they know, those wanting to develop applications, know and understand what is really needed. And I think to some extent here in Europe we can be a little guilty of developing apps through hackathons and others, perhaps without quite really understanding what exactly refugees might be needing in the community. And then the continuation of those apps, once they've been hacked or once they've been developed, often falls off at the end. And I think that is, with any app really developed, whether it's commercial or otherwise, it needs to have a user base, it needs to have a core set of values that mean users want to have it. And I think this is especially the case in East Africa, where access to technology is more limited, where understanding of how to use technology is more limited, and where the actual cost of accessing internet, for example, is proportionally quite a lot higher than in other countries that host refugee populations. So I think it's this kind of various points of importance about that we need to take into consideration when we're developing apps. And clearly things like mobile money or cash transfers and education are two of the most important, certainly from what we've seen in Kakuma.
Jenny, we've got 30 seconds. Do you want to have a very bite-sized go at what you've learned about how to develop things for new populations?
Sure. I think in East Africa, it's a great example of the humanitarian sector coming together with the private sector, specifically the mobile industry, and each of their strengths can really complement each other very well. UN organizations, NGOs in these camps in East Africa have a very good understanding of what beneficiaries need, and it needs to start from that. And then the techies can come in and support with their strengths, which is the technical expertise and the potential to reach scale. And I think that when these two sectors can come together and really understand how each other operate, that's where we're going to really provide an impact for refugees.
Collaboration, understanding, good data. That's some pretty solid findings that we've got, and some great advice, I think, to set the tone for the rest of the day. I want to thank Jenny and Ben for their insights today. That's all from us, but you can find us all throughout the day if you have any questions.